Welcome back, my favorite Tzaddik and Hasidim. Hope you are doing well, as always. In today's video, we're going to be discussing a very important subject here, which, as you can tell from the screen, is Matthew 23, 1-3. Now, why are we discussing this subject? If this is a Jewish channel, then why would we be talking about this? Well, it's for the very simple fact that the entirety of the Messianic world, unfortunately, horribly gets this passage wrong. And so many varieties of misinterpretations have sprung up in recent years that I think it's really just a good idea to clear the air and really show how Jewish the Jewish Jesus really was. He wasn't a Hebrew, he wasn't an Israelite, he was Jewish, right? We shouldn't be afraid of saying these words. He was Jewish. His Judaism was just a Geschmack Yiddishkeit. It was the most wonderful Jewishness that you could possibly Jew on any given day. Right? Little pun there for you. So without further ado, let's actually get into the text and start to analyze different aspects of it one by one. And as you'll see, I anticipate having multiple episodes because it will take a long time to get through every single last aspect of these verses. And even then, we'll probably leave some stuff out. I hope not, but it's always a possibility. So without further ado, let's read the passage here. And then Jesus spoke to the multitude and to his disciples, saying, "The scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. All therefore whatsoever they bid you observe, that observe and do. But don't do their works, for they say, but don't do." All right, so we're going to be discussing each one of these ideas, each one of these little snippets of each individual verse, one by one, so that we can properly understand everything, hopefully everything, in its proper Jewish context. So let's jump into this. So we find that it says Jesus spoke to the multitudes. Now, when we're talking about Jewish multitudes, who exactly are these people? Right? Well, Josephus has an enlightening little comment here in his book Antiquities of the Jews. And he says the Pharisees, who are one of the sects of the Jews, they have so great a power over the multitude, there's that word, that when they say anything against the king or against the high priest, they are, presently, believed. So what is this to say? It means that the Pharisees were over the people, and that the people submitted themselves to the Pharisees. That they were loved by the people, that they were trusted by the people, and as you can imagine, they also came to consider themselves the caretakers of the people. They were the representatives of the people on their behalf. Right? And we'll get into more evidence for this later on, so you don't have to take my word for it. We will be getting into more sources on this very subject. So, as a traditional rabbi himself, Jesus would have attracted a similar following as the Pharisees, and perhaps even the same followers. And as a child, he would have been the one fawning after the great Pharisaic rabbis of his youth. And perhaps this is why some Pharisees had a sense of jealousy and competition with him. What else that's interesting is that Jesus issues a command instructing both those within his movement and those outside of his movement to take action. Right? The crowd is presumed to be outside. Right? The disciples are in, the crowd is out. Right? Because they're distinguished. If they were all followers of Jesus, then it would have just said his disciples, his followers, the apostles, right? But it doesn't say that. It distinguishes between the outsiders and the insiders. So what is this to teach us? It's to teach us that everyone, those outside the movement and inside the movement, followers of Jesus and those who did not follow Jesus, this is a collective command for everybody to follow the Pharisees and the scribes, right? You say, well, that doesn't make any sense. Well, that's why we're going to have a bunch of videos, God willing, that address this very issue. So, although not unheard of, this was uncommon for Jesus since many of his teachings for large audiences involved musar, which has to do with character refinement, rather than practical, physical daily actions in the form of halakha. This would indicate the gravity of the matter, right? So that kind of gives us a little clue into who were the multitudes. We already know who the disciples were, but who were the multitudes? According to Josephus, it was the multitudes who were following the Pharisees to begin with. And so Jesus comes along and he says, "Hey, multitudes, you need to be following the scribes and Pharisees." And the multitudes say, "Oh, okay, cool, we already are. We don't have to do anything out of the ordinary." And Jesus says, "All right, step one, follow the Pharisees. You've got that down. All right, let's move on to the next thing." And speaking of moving on to the next thing, let's move on to this topic of the scribes, or in Hebrew, the Sophrim. Now, according to the Talmudic rabbis, quote, "The first of the sages were called Sophrim, or scribes." This is in Talmud Bavli, Kedushin 30a. Now, this was the case because those who copied the texts also ultimately ended up studying these very same texts. And thus, it came to pass that the most educated rabbis were the ones transmitting these ancient texts to new generations of readers, or students. And according to one renowned historian, Will Durant, which for those of you who study a lot of history will know who Will Durant is, one of the most famous historians of the 20th century. He says the scribes, which he gives the word chachamim, I'm not totally sure why, because chachamim means wise ones or learned ones. He says the scribes, whom Jesus so often bracketed with the Pharisees, were not a sect, but a profession. They were scholars learned in the Torah who lectured on it in synagogues. They taught in schools, debated it in public and private, and applied it in judgment on specific cases. So hold up, let's back up. What were the Sophrim, the scribes, what were they doing? First of all, they were copying texts because that's what a scribe does. They were scholars learned in the Torah. Scholars. They were lecturing in the synagogues, right? Teaching. They taught in the schools. They debated in public and private. And they applied it in judgment in specific cases. So what are they doing? They studied, lectured, taught, debated, and gave rulings in matters that, like in court cases. People would bring to them a problem, and they would give them a psak halakha, right, a judicial ruling, or a halakhic ruling. Returning to Will Durant's quote here, he says, "A few of them were priests, some were Sadducees, but most were Pharisees. They were in the 2 centuries before Hillel, what the rabbis were after him. They were the jurisprudentes of Judea, the judges. That's where we get the word jurisprudence in English. They were the jurisprudentes of Judea, whose legal opinions, selected by time and transmitted by word of mouth from teacher to pupil, almost like an oral tradition, became part of that oral tradition which the Pharisees honored along with the written law." So what is this to tell us? It's to tell us that these scribes were often working with the Pharisees in preserving the rabbinic tradition. But not only were they preserving it, it was almost more the Pharisees' job in preserving it, right? That's where the word Tanaim comes from. Which, by the way, the Pharisees and the Tanaim were not identical, but there was some overlap. Rather, the job of the scribes was to do one. They were to teach. They were to debate. Debate for what reason, though? Debate to get to the heart of the matter and to get to the truth, to get to the best understanding of Torah. Right? They didn't just make up things and expect people to believe them like a theologian. Nope, they put forward ideas, they presented evidence, and their friends would come and knock down their little tower and say, "No, that's a stupid argument. Here's my argument, it's much better." And people would hash things out, and over time, the best arguments would win. And so then what would happen is that these legal rulings were all collected and eventually passed down. And the Pharisees were the ones, in part, they weren't the only parties doing this, but they were one of the parties who collected these teachings and preserved them and transmitted them. Now, I think that because the next section is going to be pretty long, we're going to actually save that for another video here. Now, this one's been rather short, but hopefully this gives you a good taste for some of the material that we'll be getting into. There's plenty more ahead, so please stay tuned. Make sure to subscribe, like, comment down below, because just as the Sophrim the scribes were debating matters of halacha, right? The Jewish law, the Torah. I also want to make sure that we're all having conversations here so that we can learn from each other and share ideas too. So, without further ado, hope you have a good day. Take care.
Tzaddik, like, share, and subscribe. Come and join